Okay, well, welcome everybody to class 3 of PA 509 Applied Political Economy. Hope everybody had a good weekend, and we're now heading into really some meat of understanding what we're trying to accomplish in policy analysis and policy making, and that's really what we will focus on in the 2 chapters this evening from the Vildovsky text. I'm going to go over the overview, and there was one item, and I'm going to wait to see how many people come on. We've got 11 so far, so we are missing a few. So I'm going to take. I was going to do something to start off with, but I'll see how many people join here in the next couple of minutes. But we are going to start off with a little. This is something you did not read about, but it's something that I do feel like I should cover, and I'm going to try to cover a couple of topics like this because obviously y'all have expressed an interest in learning more about economics in the course of this class. So what we're going to do is talk about GDP, or gross domestic product, and I'll show you the resources that are available from the Bureau of Economic Analysis with respect to that. We're also then going to get into our discussion of assigned reading, cover chapters 2 and 3 from Vildovsky, chapter 2 covering the idea of collective goals, and chapter 3 going into Pareto concepts. There will be a class exercise if we have time, and then we will take some time to review the week 4 assignment. So busy night, but I think we can get done on time, and I look forward to the discussion. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. And I say we got people still coming in, but we'll go ahead and get started. What I'd like to do first is talk about GDP, which is gross domestic product. And gross domestic product has a couple of different definitions. I am just going to share one that I think probably is the easiest one. And it's really, and we need to think about this definition here. It says the value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year. So gross domestic product is really a measure of economic output, and it can be less in a country. There are measures that have been established to look at it from the perspective of a state or even of counties and metropolitan areas. So the reality is that we're going to start off with talking about GDP from the perspective of a nation, but the reality is that it's really comes down to a geographic area, and this has become kind of the standard measurement that is used to determine the condition of the economy overall. So when it can either be in a phase of growth or in a phase of recession, and we have not seen this technically defined this way since the late 1920s to early to mid 1930s, a depression. And that's typically measured from the basis of gross domestic product, how the overall value, the monetary value, a singular value of the economy in terms of goods produced and services provided, how it changes from year to year, or in most cases, quarter to quarter. So let's talk about, what we see. So we're going to go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA.gov. And as you can see, the first thing that comes up is they actually do analysis not just for the 50 states, but they also do it for the additional 7 territories. The District of Columbia and the additional territories, and one of those being America Samoa. They do a measure of their GDP with respect to theirs, but then they also, of course, do it from a national perspective. And GDP, gross domestic product, is calculated quarterly, and it's calculated on the basis of an annualized amount. So when you read GDP, when it talks about the numbers, you're really looking at it from an annualized perspective, but that information is updated quarterly in 3-month increments. Typically, and of course it works that it's based as of the end of March, as the end of June, as the end of September, and of course the end of December. And so the way GDP is calculated and presented by the Bureau of Economic Analysis is they typically come out with their first report for the most recent quarter at the end of the following month. So the Q2, which was be the end of June, that first measure came out in late July, and then about a little over a week ago, the what they call the first update or second reading, which is basically an update of their work with more information, was published in late August. There will be a third reading or second update that'll come out later this month, which will kind of be the final reading of where GDP was for Q2, and that'll use to go forward. So let's just view this report that comes up. Excuse me. The second estimate, as I said before, this is the second one. This is the first revision. As you can see, if you look at this first paragraph, the real focus when we look at gross domestic product is what we call real gross domestic product, which is gross domestic product adjusted for inflation. We realize, and this is very important because it really gives us an idea of how much the economy is really going versus how much of the value of the economy is inflated by inflation itself. So by looking at real gross domestic product, we try to weigh out inflation impact, and as such, that gives an idea of actual growth. And again, we have to remember these are annualized numbers, so they are not reflective specifically of this is not just what happened in the quarter, but it's looking at from an annualized perspective. First paragraph shows just how significant these revisions can be. We knew in July that Q2 was going to go down. There was pretty strong estimation that Q2 was we were going to see a decrease in the second quarter reading. We weren't exactly what that was going to be. It ended up being it was about zero. It was based on, it was at 0.9%, and this carried forward a decline that we saw in the first quarter of 1.6%. Now, most economists have traditionally ruled that if you have two consecutive quarters where you have a decline in GDP, that signals a recession. What I will also say is that there are other factors that are considered in declaring a recession. The technical group that does declare when there's a recession is the NBER, if I'm correct, National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a nonprofit organization, and they are the ones who actually, in their group of economic advisors from across the country, will look at the data, and typically a couple of months or even a year after a recession starts, they'll declare that it was the start of a recession. They'll declare the start of a recession period, and sometimes if a recession is very short, they'll declare the start and the end of the recession within a certain period of time. So from a layman's perspective, because of the fact that two-quarter statement definition is driven into the dialogue of media coverage with respect to the economy, you can say that we are now in a recession based on the common conventional definition of one. At the same time, you can also say that we may be in a recession, but it isn't necessarily a recession yet, because when you look at other information such as employment information, consumer spending, and other areas, the economy seems to still be in a growth period because we are adding jobs. We've consistently added jobs the last several months in terms of overall employment, and consumer spending continues to increase. Now, inflation has a lot to do with that, but people are still spending more in terms of real dollars than they were in previous months. So we have to keep those in mind. We also see that wages are going up. We do have, of course, one of the first indicators of a recession coming, and that is that nationally, this is not Raleigh market or any of the markets that are around us, but nationally, home prices have gone down. They have started to go down a little bit. You may even see in our local market some situations where homes are now having their desired sale prices reduced by 5-10%. That's not the norm here. but that does happen. But generally speaking, at a national level, which is how this measure of GDP is calculated, we are starting to see significant softening in the housing market with respect to sales and new construction. So looking at it from this perspective, let me scroll down a little bit and show you the chart. You can see 2020 obviously is a pretty wild ride. Obviously, we knew there was going to be declines in Q1 and Q2 due to COVID and the fact that COVID came along. What I will also say about Q1 is that Q1 can be very volatile from year to year with respect to the economy because of the impact of weather. Weather can have considerable impact on productivity, particularly in the Northeast, the Midwest, some parts of the South, and even out West. There's some national exposure to that. And so what ends up happening is that Q1 you can be in a overall growth cycle, but because of some contraction due to the fact that certain things can't be done when you can't get to the factory, or you can't get your logistical systems break down due to weather, there is the possibility for little blips that occur in the economy in Q1 where it actually declines. It catches up usually in Q2, no problem. But as you can see here, due to COVID in 2020, we had a very, very brief drop off, but a significant drop off, particularly in Q2, because that represents when we had the shutdown of most of the US economy for a significant period of the second quarter. As you can see, Q3 jumped right back up because there was a significant variance, because a lot of parts of the country, including North Carolina, started reopening pretty immediately. Plus, there was a significant amount of capital infusion, cash infusion made at all levels of the economy, including in terms of personal income, by the government in response to the lockdowns that were determined to be necessitated by COVID. But then as you go forward, you see that there's been a period of growth through most of through Q4 2020 and all of 2021. There are economists who believe that 2020 and 2021 was due in large part by the continued stimulation of the economy at the federal level. And some of that's true, but some of it is also the result of the fact that the economy reopened. And if you look at numbers going back 2019, 2020, and 2018, we were having consistent muted growth compared to where we were prior to 2008, but we were still having a period of growth prior to a trend of growth that really started in the early 2010s and continued for almost a decade of growth, a period of growth that we did see where GDP continued to grow, which is a rather long growth period. Typically, when you look at economic cycles, you typically have 5 to 6 years of growth, then you have a recession, and then you have growth again. So we have to understand that there is a flow to this. Recessions are inevitable in the economy. There's no guarantee that we can prevent or stop recessions. They can certainly be influenced by public policy. There's some arguments to be made that they are being influenced, that our current recession is being influenced by public policy. But the reality is that they are also influenced by other factors. What we know right now is that the significant rise of inflation that we've experienced in the last 2 years, or that's the result of the last 2 years from significant increases of the money supply and minimal increases in productivity, have created a situation where inflation has become a significant drag on the economy in many ways. So what makes it to where you end up with negative GDP? What do the statisticians and researchers use to measure, to determine how to come up with GDP? Well, in the narrative, it talks about that this decrease reflected decreases in private inventory investment, residential fixed investment, federal government spending, and state and local spending. What that basically means is that there's several components, both private and public, that contribute to the overall economy. And it's not just spending. It's also investment. That's important to remember, that this takes into account both spending and investment. As you can see, it says exports and consumer spending increased, as did imports, which imports actually when we count imports, it actually reduces GDP because obviously you're importing the good in, not producing it. But the reality is that the private inventory investment, we knew that was a challenge because corporations had cut down on their investments in the second quarter. We also know that while the federal, state, and local governments are spending a lot of money, they're not spending as much money as they were during the COVID lockdown and the period immediately after the COVID lockdown. Those were meant to be one-time expenditures, and as such, it does create a challenge in the fact that money has to either be made up somewhere else or is going to affect the overall level of economic productivity. Tim, you had a question. I see. How has supply chain disruptions contributed to this? Seems like buying was strong for when it was available, but is down due to a lack of available resources. So what we have to remember is that there's a couple of different things to think about. First of all, we still have a deficit with respect to the workforce that is primarily involved in those industries that are tied to the supply chain, manufacturing, logistics, and all of those. And that has an effect as well. That has one effect. We've seen the video, you've probably heard about the fact that in a lot of our major ports, there was a significant backup of container ships coming from other parts of the world, mainly from Asia, but also from Europe and other places, to drop off product, and they were not able to be unloaded because there simply wasn't the personnel to be able to unload them. One of the states that had one of the most significant COVID lockdown policies and still has this in place is California, and it's home to some of our key ports on the Pacific. The port of Long Beach is probably the most notable of that. So the reality is that because staffing has still not recovered in these areas, the production is still down, and it's created a problem where, as a result, and this started actually last year, if you go back and look at the inflation numbers, you started having a situation where there were simply too few goods. It was interesting because during the actual first year, during 2020, there was sufficient inventory in a lot of ways to be able to satisfy the fact that people had money. Many people were still getting paid, and people also had the money that they were receiving from the federal government. So there were resources out there that kind of enabled people to buy things to improve quality of life or to buy the necessities they needed. The problem was nothing that restarting the production side, those inventories were drawn down, those inventories had to be brought back up, created this problem. And what's happening now, and this is especially true in the clothing industry, is that a lot of companies, Target is probably the one that's gotten the most news about this. These retailers now have a substantial amount of supply that's sitting on their shelves. We were doing back to school shopping for my daughter a couple of weeks ago, and we did it at an outlet mall in South Carolina because we just happened to be there that weekend. And I was shocked by going in these stores, and granted, they're outlet stores, you expect there to be a discount, but I was shocked by just how low the prices were for these clothes. And we ended up getting out of there for a lot less than what I thought it was. And then this weekend, my daughter had to buy a dress for a formal coming up, and she bought a very age appropriate and very nice basically a ball gown that was originally listed in around the 120 to 150 range, but they had marked it all the way down all the way down to $30. So there's a lot of inventory that's sitting out there that's being devalued, that was bought up, but because of inflation, people don't have the money necessarily to buy things like that unless they have to. And so that can be a challenge as well. And then, but there's a lot of factors. But here's something I wanted to also point. I talked about real GDP, but also current dollar GDP is not adjusted for inflation. That's in current dollars, and that amount goes up. But you can see that if we valued the inflation, if we didn't care about reducing for inflation, that the role of inflation in growing the value of our productivity was significant. It was about 8.4% at an annualized rate. And that's a lot. But as we know, because of the fact that inflation is higher than 8.4% in reality, that the situation that as a result, because of the lack of productivity that we saw overall in the second quarter, GDP went down. There's a lot of additional information that's provided into this. I was looking for one thing in particular. I'll need to pull up a chart. So when you pull up the news release, there's a lot of other related materials. So I'm going to pull up this PDF, see if it has it in here. I don't know if it does or not. So this is what comprises GDP. Line 1 is the overall measure of GDP. And then there are various categories and groups. The first one is personal consumption expenditures. And as you can see, that actually went up in real dollars at an annualized rate of 1.5%. Then you have goods, and this is the part that is, and so then you have some subcategories, how much we spend on goods and how much we spend on services. Goods actually went down, but services picked up. And this is important because services cratered significantly during the pandemic. As you can see here, purchasing of services, which can be any kind of service, professional or otherwise, it was up 1.7% in 2019. It dropped 7.5% in 2020, and it only went up 5.8% in 2021. So we need this number to be strong, because we hope that at least by the end of 22, we finish the year where where overall, the overall consumption of services on an inflation adjusted metric is consistent to where we were prior to the pandemic. Then you have what's called gross private domestic investment. And there's two different, the main one here is fixed investment. And as you can see, that investment went down significantly, 13.2%. And most of that was actually in residential investment, i.e. house buying or house building, went down 16.2%. We are still struggling with that. And, inflation has had a role, the fact that interest rates have gone up. There's a lot of factors overall that are dramatically affecting the housing industry. And in many markets, we're already starting to see a significant drawdown in sale prices, not as much here in the Triangle or in surrounding areas because of the nature of our inward migration and growth economically, but on a national level, it's a major challenge. Then we have net exports of goods and services. Exports count as a positive. It actually went up 17.6%, and that ties a lot. And it actually went up more in services than it did in goods. There has been some growth in goods, primarily the fact that we do export energy to other parts of the world, and that's gone up some due to the crisis in the Ukraine. But then there's also the strongest area in this area is actually in services. So that's something we have to keep in mind, that we do export a lot of services to the rest of the world. And then on the import side, it went up a little bit. And again, that import was also mostly in the form of services. Then you have government consumption, which we talked about. And as you can see, that went down 1.8%. The main one was federal, going down 3.9%. And again, that was because these one-time spending resolutions that have been passed by Congress for the last couple of years due to COVID are starting to slow down and close out. It'll be interesting to see how some of the more recent pieces of legislation, like the infrastructure bill last year, or the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that was adopted this year, influence that. So we have to keep that in mind. But this is a lot of good information that you have a chance to take a look at. Like I said, also, give me just a second. Like I also said, you can find information about GDP. I gotta look for it, so give me just a second. You can find more localized GDP information. You can find it out by state, and that's updated quarterly. It's delayed, but it is updated quarterly. They then also have it by county or by metropolitan statistical area. This is updated annually. And it typically comes out about 10 to 12 months after the end of the year that's being calculated for. So for example, we won't have 2021 data until either real late this year or the first of next year. So we have to keep that in mind. But let's say we want to look at state. You see here, this is as of, they still have only done through the first quarter. And you can see a lot of states saw a reduction in GDP, of real GDP. You can see North Carolina's dropped at an annualized rate of 1.4% in the first quarter. That's not great, obviously. There are some states that did better, like Georgia at 0.6%. Georgia has seen a significant increase in manufacturing the last couple of years. But at the same time, then you've got some other areas that saw more significant declines. Texas went down 2.3%. Pennsylvania went down 2.2%. Overall there, and then you see up in the Mountain West area due to energy. At that time, it's probably changed significantly now to where it's probably in the positive area. But at that time, due to the fact that those are predominantly energy and natural resource states, they saw a significant reduction in GDP in Montana, Wyoming, and in the Dakotas. So that's good information to have in terms of knowing. But you can't. But this does get updated pretty regularly. In fact, the next release, which will be for the second quarter, will come out September 30th. So at the end of this month, we'll find out how we did in Q2. And then, like I also said, you can find it by county, metro, and other areas. When they do it like this, instead of showing the information the way we saw it before, when they do state and local, they actually show it from an industrial group perspective. So what that means is they actually look at it a little differently. And let me show you real quick. You can actually, and again, this is, as you see here, 2020. So let's say we want to look up Wake County. They go through pretty straightforward. So let's do Wake County only. Just won't. Hope everybody's okay with this. I want to do all statistics in table. We'll just do it for 2020. That didn't show what I wanted it to show. Well, I'm not going to, you can find it for yourself. Again, this is just for your information purposes, but as you can see here, GDP information is, as you can see, the total value of, according to this, if you were to ask what's the total gross domestic product of Wake County, it would be close to in 2020, it was close to $75.5 billion. Which, I mean, that's a significant amount of money. Just to give you an idea, the Rocky Mount metropolitan area is around 5 billion. So that's 15 times greater than the economic value of where I live. So these are, that gives you an idea of just how large and strong the economy just in Raleigh is. And then you take into account all the other counties that are surrounding Wake, as well as the areas of Durham and Chapel Hill. It's a very strong economic area and represent a substantial share of the overall GDP in the state of North Carolina. So are there any questions that anybody has with respect to GDP?
How exactly do they get all of that
Yes,
data?
Lindsay, we're not able to hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now? Shoot.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Still not able to hear you.
I could hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, same here.
Okay, she can hear you. I can't. Hold on one second. Okay, Lindsay, try again.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. My question was, how exactly do they get all of that data?
It's a combination of survey data, some resources that they have, as well as calculations that they've made based on prior information. So it's kind of like with the rest of this. Like employment data is actually, there's two types of employment data, and they're both surveys that are then extrapolated for the purposes of providing a profile. And GDP is very similar, and that's why they have to do these updates on in the following months, because they'll have this kind of initial set of data that they'll have at the end of the immediately after the end of the quarter, and then they'll have to update what they find based on additional information that comes after that. Anybody else? Okay. All right. So we're going to get started with chapter 2 and talk about collective goals. In our work, we have to think very much about this idea of the public interest in terms of the work we do in public policy at any level of government or in any organization. And there are two ways of looking at it, and they are not necessarily the same. And Vildovsky talks about the will of all versus general will. What are the differences between those two? Anyone?
I remember it being, I think the will of all was more like on a person by person basis of what their individual wills were. The other one is more of a average, I guess.
Right. Yeah. The will of all is, as a singular will, it does not exist. It's more of an individualized perspective. And for example, I've got a project coming up here in the next couple of weeks where for my jurisdiction, we need to do community engagement meetings to determine how to spend about half of the money that we got from the American Rescue Plan. And what I'm trying to do is satisfy the desire that our residents have to express their own opinions, i.e. capture the will of all, and then try to translate that into identifying general will, trying to find those ideas, concepts, and focal points that the vast majority or the largest possible majority or consensus of the public has in terms of how they want the money spent. And so we're doing that through an online survey. There's a printed version that we'll distribute, and then we also have an open comment portal. And then we also are going to do 10 public meetings. because we have 7 wards, so we do one for each ward in each ward, and then we have 3 that'll be citywide. And the way I've conceptualized it, and the way I want to do it, is that we will capture as much data as we can through these processes, and then use software to try to aggregate where we can and try to identify common themes. And I need to figure out how to get that done before we start next week. But the reality is that what you find in any size organization, in any size jurisdiction, is there's always going to be different opinions and different goals. And what you have to do is, in order to identify what the public interest is, and again, this is where you're the one who kind of, you or your staff that you're working with, and obviously the elected officials, have to develop an idea of what that's going to be, based on as many different as many inputs as you can handle. And technology has tried to make it easier, but in some ways it has created disconnects, because we have to remember there are people who don't have access to technology. There are people that are not comfortable with technology. And what I've noticed in the deployment of technology, that it has a tendency to limit how people can participate in a process. And I'll give you an example. We did a corridor study for an impoverished area of our city. It's been about 5-6 years ago that we did this study. We hired a firm to do the assessment and to put together a study for that corridor. And they did do some public meetings. They had a website. I mean, they had a web survey. They did some public meetings. And the challenge with the public meetings was they were kind of using a concept that's now become very popular. The state uses it relentlessly at DOT, where they have these meetings where everything is up on boards. And of course, they give you stickers to put dots on, like, well, do you like this idea? Do you like that idea? They're trying to get input and participation, but it's already very structured, and it really precludes an individual from being able to provide a less structured response or less structured feedback that actually in turn is more important to understand with respect of what the incumbent residents of a given neighborhood or area want in terms of how they want their area transformed or improved. So we actually cut that project off midway before they could finish their work, and we actually went out and got another consultant who did a more open-ended approach, where we actually just simply did listening sessions. And they were able to effectively take the data from those listening sessions and were able to come up with recommendations. And the key thing with that is that it increased the level of participation and buy-in from the residents. I'm not saying that the more modern concepts aren't usable, but they are a challenge, and there is a lot lost in it. So this is something where in some cases we kind of have to reverse ourselves in terms of how we do this stuff, because generally speaking, most of the public can understand that if they're being shown something and they're being asked to vote on it, they already realize that decisions have been made, and they already believe that their role in the process has been muted or reduced more so than they were expecting. So we kind of have to keep that in mind with respect to this. Of course, it's hard to tell planners anything, but that's just part of the deal. So let's talk about rationality. Obviously, what we have to deal with, we have to establish rationality with what we do. We can't go pie in the sky, and understanding that. But there's 2 concepts. Well, let me start off with this. In general, what does Wildavsky say about establishing rationality in developing collective goals? Did everybody hear me ask the question? Because I think my internet was slowing down a little bit.
Are you referring to the part where he talks about any rational person can think any crazy concept or thing? Or am
Yeah.
I misunderstanding?
No,
Okay.
you got it. No, you got it. We're trying to achieve rationality, but the reality we have is rational people can still be irrational. And that truly comes about in a lot of different ways. So when we think of rationality, what are his suggestions for how to address it?
Is this where he talks about kind of setting up all like defining an issue as like a set of alternatives and
Mhm.
okay, sorry,
Yeah.
my notes are kind of jumbled.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
And again, it can be a little bit of a challenge. Well, he talks about these two concepts of completeness and transitivity. Obviously we're trying to achieve, when we set up goals, we're trying to make them as complete as possible. We want to, I mean, y'all have probably heard of when you're writing goals, the whole acronym of SMART, that definitely can apply to the concept of goals, of trying to achieve completeness with respect to setting a goal. So let's talk about transitivity. Anybody want to try to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I can try it.
Okay.
So it looks like transitivity is like where you have multiple preferences, and then essentially you can rank your preferences in order. And if you prefer one thing to another, like if you prefer, I don't know, apples to oranges and then oranges to bananas, then you know you're going to prefer apples to bananas.
Right. Yeah. This is when you have to start kind of using a little bit of math, which is not the intention here, but it does play a role because it's similar to the laws in math that, and the apples, oranges, and bananas is an excellent example of that one of the biggest challenges we have when we're dealing with multiple preferences is figuring out which one is going to have the most value or most benefit or be the most preferred. That's a huge challenge. And so understanding with respect to rank order or any other kind of methodology you can use to create a way to enable an understanding of the priority of preference that a collective can have, that the public interest can have, is very important. And to do this, there are a multitude of ways using aggregation to be able to achieve identifying what the goal should be, i.e., what the benefit you're trying to achieve should be, or the problem, or the way in which the problem should be solved. First one would be one option is the pairwise majority. Somebody want to explain that?
Isn't that just like if individuals in a society prefer X to Y, then the society prefers X to Y? Or if a majority of individuals do that?
Yeah, basically, it's very similar to how they made decisions in the democracy of Athens. They would basically have, they would basically have, they used a very, for a long time, they used a very pure form of democracy in that everybody participated. And what they would do is they would outline two preferences, or in one case, a yes or a no, and they would basically say, if you want to go one way, and basically, of course, nobody could read or write in this society. Very few people could read or write, so they use different colored beans or different colored beads And they basically would put them in a basket, whether they preferred one or the other, or yes or no, and they counted them, and that's how they determined what action to take. Then we also have what's known as the Borda count. Anybody want to explain that one?
I think the board account, that's where it's like ranked in order of preference. So you would give like, if you're ranking from like 1 to 10, like 10 being the best and 1 being the least, like reverse of that, like 1 would be your favorite, and then so on and so forth. And then kind of rank the most preferred candidate depending on who gets the lowest or the highest score, depending on what the scale is, I guess.
Right, very similar to ranked choice that has become, we have now, and you probably saw this with respect to what happened with the most recent congressional election in Alaska, where they used it, where they and Maine, I think there may be one other state, but I know that Maine and Alaska both use ranked choice. Louisiana does it a little differently, but it's not ranked choice. But the idea being that people could choose more than one candidate, and as a result, basically saying that if nobody gets the majority, then we drop the lowest one, look at the rest of them, and see if we can get a majority from there. At the end of the day, in that case, the person who ended up winning on the second ballot, you could say, was the person who was leading. Was the person leading on the first ballot. So it didn't swap or invert the results. It just basically reconfirmed the results, because in a lot of cases she was the second choice on a lot of tickets. So that is something that we know of, that's being used, and the jury's still out on whether or not people like it, but it is an option that's starting to be applied in various states. But with Borda, it is prioritization, and it's really the idea that you're trying to get the audience, you're trying to get people, when you're dealing with more than 2 options, especially if you're doing, like, say, more than 3, you're looking at 4 or 5 different options. You got to figure out how do you reach a consensus, try to reach a decision that represents a consensus when you're trying to set goals or set recommendations. That's a very important way of doing it. Then we have this idea of universal domain. What do we mean by universal domain?
Is this where like all the preferences of all the voters or people who are involved are allowed? So everybody's preferences come into play.
Yeah, that's basically what we're talking about. I mean, and it can be crazy, to be honest. It's kind of the idea of what you sometimes deal with when you're trying to do strategic planning, or what I'm going to be doing here in a couple of weeks, is you want to be able to capture as much information as you can, but you realize that you're going into it with the understanding that not everything is going to be considered equally. And that, because, I mean, it is you have to facilitate a transitive process to be able to identify preferences. There is a significant element of unanimity that's required, even though in a lot of cases this is captured in non-unanimous. You want if you can, try to achieve unanimity. But you also have to remember that amongst the alternatives that are being presented, some of them will be irrelevant or undoable. For example, I've got $5 million, you know, the total amount that we have is $5 million. So any idea that costs more than $5 million is automatically out. And preferably, I don't want to spend all $5 million on only one thing. So you kind of have to work at it in different ways. So there are some challenges with it. So to figure out, we also then have this concept known as Arrow's theorem. Does anybody want to define it? Somebody who hasn't gone yet.
He basically says the only way to get to this, you know, these three criteria is through a dictatorship.
Exactly. Yep. It's like, and yeah, but yeah, it's, Arrow's theorem is, Mary Cole, you said about Parks and Rec. I always think of Gilmore Girls, because in they always have the episodes. They have, at least they have a mayor, but of course it seems like every episode that I saw, they always had a town hall meeting and the people in the town made decisions. It also seemed to always happen with The Simpsons. So, which is funny because really, just to let y'all know, there are town hall government still exists in the Northeast. It's pretty much exclusive to New England. And there are still little hamlets where everybody gets together as a community and makes decisions. And they typically, when they do that, they try to keep it down to a binary choice of one or the other, or yes or no. I will say this, I have to preface this. I know that there's a lot of people in this that teach and who do this stuff that use Parks and Recreation a lot. I personally never liked the show, partly because people compared me to one particular character on the show who was not necessarily treated well by his coworkers. So I don't, it's not my favorite, but for those of you who get a lot out of it, I totally understand. So just to make that clear. But in Arrow's theorem, at the end of the day, I think I used this analogy, I think in the first class, the scene in episode 2 where Anakin's like, they just need to decide and do it. That's kind of what leads to a dictatorship. So you have the reality that and it's the way, I'm trying to remember which of the founders said this, but they talked about with respect to our government, it's the worst government, except it's the least effective government except for everything else. So the reality is that a lot of times when it comes to that level of decision making, it ends up quickly devolving itself into a singular decision maker who decides we're going to do this. And you have to kind of keep that in mind with respect, particularly with the work you do, because, for example, if you work in municipal government or county government in a council manager form of government, and that's where I would imagine those of you who choose to work in those levels of government will be working in, at least at some point in your careers. The reality is that and this is the case in most jurisdictions in North Carolina, that the manager, the city or county manager or town manager, has a significant amount of power and authority, and it's very easy for them, and they can do this in very benevolent and effective ways, but it's very easy for them to feel like that they're in a position to make those type of decisions without a lot of going around the room. They may ask for feedback, but at the end of the day, they will try to centralize the decision-making process. Same thing happens on university campuses a lot of the time. Those type of things do happen. So any other questions at this point? Okay. Continuing collective goals. So we know that there are weaknesses to the discussions that we've had before. So there's a couple of other options that Vildovsky throws out in terms of alternatives to trying to make decision-making more efficient. This idea of positive responsiveness, anybody want to chime in on that? Pretty self-explanatory.
Is that where it's saying like if everyone in society is like indifferent to an option, if one person changes their opinion, then that would break the indifference?
Well, that's more the unanimity or indifference rule.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That covers the second one. And that's, I mean, that does happen a lot. I mean, that's honestly our first national government after the Declaration of Independence. That was the case. All decisions by the colonies had to be made unanimously. There was no, they couldn't even run off of a majority or a supermajority. All 13 colonies had to agree with whatever policy the national government wanted to take. And that was the government established by the Articles of Confederation. So we go back to positive responsiveness.
Just based on the text, it says an aggregation procedure is positively responsive if such a change breaks the social indifference so that society now strictly prefers X to Y.
Yep, that's basically it. It's the idea that you try to figure out, what, where people are. It's a little less formal, but you're trying to make sure that you figure out where people are. And if people respond, it's the kind of thing, and I will tell you, you will run into this a lot, and some of you probably already have in your careers. There's a lot of times where you can have a good idea and you're kind of looking for somebody. You're thinking, okay, there's going to be some people are going to like it and some people are not going to like it, and then you ask people for their feedback and everyone's kind of like, yeah, it's okay. Nobody says anything against it, but nobody is jumping up and down and championing it either. And so you're kind of stuck with the situation as, well, do I go with this? And so you kind of then have to incrementally say, okay, well, let me take the first couple of steps and see how people will respond to it. And if people respond to it well, then you're in good shape. If they don't respond to it well, then you kind of, okay, say, what do I need to change or do I need to stop? Weak dictator, I'm not going to go into this one much, but obviously we talked about with Arrow's theorem, the idea being that you can at sometimes there is a need for somebody to just make the decision, but you don't want to put them, but there are those influences, that there are those ways to influence them or kind of constrain them with respect to their decisions so that they are not in a position where they can just totally go into one direction without any control. So along with Arrow's theorem, we have the concept of May's theorem, which deals with the idea of majority rule. And it's important to understand that in developing this, that there has to be anonymity. Again, this is where we get the concept of the secret ballot here in the United States and many other parts, and most of the other parts of the world, the idea that when people make their choices, they need to be able to make them anonymously. There is the intention to be neutral in terms of how ideas are presented, not to necessarily advocate for one alternative over another. And then getting back to that issue of positive responsiveness, it's to try to, with the understanding of where the majority is with respect to preferences, we can have an idea of the direction to take. Anybody want to add anything with respect to May's theorem?
So I have a question. So who does the neutrality apply to? If you can understand what I'm asking.
Absolutely. So like one example that I will give is in bond referendums that are done by local governments. Under North Carolina's Constitution, if we want to issue what's called a general obligation bond, that has to be approved by voter referendum. So the voters get a chance to vote on that. The government is extremely limited in what it can do to provide information for the voters. The government cannot advocate that people pass the referendum. We simply put the referendum together. There's certain requirements we have, especially now with respect to providing estimates of cost and information. But the government itself that's asking for the money can't say to people, you should do this. Now, independent groups, and they can also be comprised of elected officials, can go out separate of the government and advocate or lobby the public to vote for it, and they often do. But the government, like for example, me in my position, I can't go out there and say whether we should do it or not. If someone were to ask me about it, all I can do is say, here is the factual information about this. And it gets back to the fact that as in public administration, one of the things we always have to remember, and we have to do this to the best of our ability, is when we are presenting information on proposals of policy, whether it's to, and you have a little more leeway when you're presenting it to staff, but when you're presenting it to elected officials or the public, you have a responsibility to present it in a neutral case, which means you have to let the facts make the argument for you. The information you're sharing make the argument for you, because you personally cannot advocate for that decision, because you're supposed to not have a bias one way or another in these matters. So that can be a challenge. Getting back to positive responsiveness, and this ties directly, because Lindsay asked, this ties directly back to, Anthony, did I answer your question?
Yeah, but I had something. I'll circle back after you answer this question, because you might.
Okay. Right. Positive responsiveness ties into that. The easiest way to look at it is positive. What positive responsiveness really means, the easiest way to understand it is that what we're talking about is that that's the positive response means if you have two alternatives or multiple alternatives, it means it's the one that has the greatest positive response. Where are people's strongest positive, where's the population or the group's strongest positive feelings are with respect to a choice between alternatives. So in a lot of ways, it can be perceived as what's the will of the majority. So that's basically what it means.
And is that just based on whether it's strictly or weakly preferred? Like the text talks about that, but I don't remember if it actually gives a definition for weak preference or strong preference.
There is a lot of that's true, and it's a challenge. I mean, it's kind of like the adage that we have about candidates for public office. It's pick the lesser of two evils for a lot of voters. So in that way, you're treating positive responsiveness is it's weak, but the reality is that in all choices, you're not necessarily going to have a strong get a strong response. You're going to you have a lot of times get a weak response. That can often happen, and what you have to do when you get a strong response, that gives you a little more leeway in terms of implementation and how you can go forward. When you get a weak response, you have to identify that and be more careful and cautious in how you would implement the policy. Does that make sense, Chris?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And this is something that comes up a lot, particularly in elections, and we're about to go into another wonderful election season coming up that'll culminate in November. There's a tendency a lot of times for analysts, especially when they're looking at political issues, to try to identify this I guess the word we use today is avatar, known as the median voter. Try to get an idea of, well, what's the, and it's important to understand this is the median voter, not the mean voter or the average voter. This is the median voter, which means that you're trying to find that person in the middle, and you're trying to gauge what their preferences and what their opinions with respect to the alternatives at play are. And it can be very challenging to do that. But if you know it, because then you kind of look at where the median stands with everybody else, and you can kind of get an idea, is there the support available to reach a point where you can achieve, where you can establish a collective goal. We also tie into this, we also understand that when it comes to issues, there's going to be, and going back to stronger and weaker, there's going to be more intensity with respect to these issues. Anybody, let me just ask, anybody want to comment on what Vildovsky says regarding intensity?
I might be able to speak to that.
Sure.
I think he talks about how like we've ranked them in order, I guess, but we haven't talked about the difference in intensities between those ranks.
Right. It gets to the fact that how strong do people feel about the ranking of the alternatives? And it's not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's really getting into the depth of that. And like, for example, in performance evaluation of programs and services, and this is especially done with nonprofits, but it's also applicable to government, there is a tendency to default an understanding of a performance score to the mean score. So let's say you do a Likert from 1 to 5, and a result comes back, around a 4, and that the average result of the score is a 4. That's good, but what you're also wanting to look at is what is the spread of those responses, not just the average, but what's the spread of those responses. And in reality, if you end up with a couple with, like, let's say it's 1 to 5, you've got a 4, but let's say you've got a handful of 1s, then there's a problem there that you need to be able to identify. Because even though you've got an overall score of 4, you don't want, you're going to get some, you obviously want all 5s. People at the store will tell you that. You try to get, you want all 5s, as many 5s as possible, and then you want everything else to be 4s or 3s, preferably 4s, but occasionally you'll get a 3. You don't want to ever get 2s or 1s, because even though that's going to be a small number of them, that indicates that there are people that have a stronger feeling or more intense feeling with respect to whatever you're trying to evaluate from the perspective of service or performance or whatever the case may be. Are there any other questions with respect to Chapter 2 on collective goals? Okay. So now we come to Chapter 2. I'm sorry, Chapter 3. And this is your introduction to Pareto concepts. And you will rarely hear anybody in the public sector talk about what they do or policy or alternatives or anything from the perspective of saying that it's Pareto efficient or anything like that. It is good, however, to understand what these concepts are, because you do have the ability to keep them in mind when you're developing policy or evaluating policy and trying to determine which alternatives to recommend. Because this goes away from the public perspective of policy and really gets into the into our understanding of really trying to figure out the best result. So let's start off with the first topic there. What does it mean for an alternative to be Pareto dominant?
So is it referring to that one outcome is going to be like better or is better than the other one?
Yes, when you're in a situation, typically where you have two alternatives, the Pareto is going to be the best option. It's pretty straightforward. It's the best option of the two. And that's, you go through the analysis process to determine that. And that typically is something that you find when you're dealing with only two alternatives. So you kind of have to keep that in mind. What does it mean when we achieve Pareto improvement? Somebody else.
Well, I have a question about the first thing you said. In the book, it says Pareto dominance formalizes our notion of a choice on which everyone could agree. So that pretty much the same thing that you were just saying just now when, what did you exactly say? I can't think of the words that you said. Is that pretty much?
Didn't say it exactly that way, but it's consistent.
Okay.
It's another way of looking at it. You know, you can either look at it from the standpoint of choice, which is what your definition describes. It's more of like, where's the consensus, or, you know, the highest ranked choice, or whatever the case may be. Also, you can look at it from study and say that it's the most effective of the two options. So it applies in both cases.
Okay.
So what does a Pareto improvement mean?
So I believe the Pareto improvement, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. I believe the Pareto improvement is the move from policy Y to an alternative policy X if X Pareto dominates Y.
Right. It's basically, I mean, it's in the word improvement. What step can you take to improve upon what action can you take that will create the greatest improvement, or the greatest, or because we look at it from an incremental perspective, the best incremental, the best potential for incremental change, or greatest benefit. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, Anthony, did you have something?
Yes. So when I look at this stuff, I try to put it in terms like that I can easily remember and try to understand. And so with the Pareto improvement, is it like having to anything to do with incentivizing improving, like people, trying to say this right, like receiving any type of, you know, benefit, and like they're all trying to do it collectively?
That's possible, yes.
Okay.
That's entirely possible. That's
Because the book definition, like if you look at it, literally can get you a little tripped up. That's why I try to think of it in different ways.
yeah, and I will tell you, like I said to begin with, Pareto is not a term that if you hear, I've worked in local government for, you know, for 20 years now, and I think I've only heard it once. So these concepts, finding a way to understand them more substantively, like you're doing, is very important, because nobody's going to know. You go into a room and you're giving a presentation and you say, you know, this is the Pareto dominant or the Pareto improvement or Pareto efficient respect. Everyone's going to look at you like, what did you say? I mean, that's just the reality. And that's not a criticism of anybody, because many of them had it in class and don't remember it themselves either. So that's just the way it is. So you got it right. So let's go to Pareto efficient. What does the Pareto efficient mean?
Isn't it like where you're at a point where you can't move like resources or goods to anywhere else without making something worse in doing so?
That does apply to it. Let me, that's basically, well, when we talk about Pareto efficient, we also, that's basically what you said. We also call it Pareto optimal. Looking at my notes, and I apologize because I have to go back and look at this stuff myself from time to time, but that's right. Because basically you've got a decision in place, but if you change it, there's the possibility that there's going to be negative trade-offs to somebody else. So, you know, you kind of have to stick with the decision. It's you kind of have to stick with it because it doesn't hurt anyone, or it doesn't hurt anyway, but doing it, but making a change to it may result in some type of harm or injury to somebody with respect to access to resources or, you know, other things. When we talk about changes in policy, we have to think of a couple of different things. We deal with policy changes. We talk about efficiency and distribution. And this is where I will go ahead and say that we have to remember this book was written in the 70s. So it's over 40 years old, closer to 50 years old now. And when we talk about efficiency, and I'll talk about this a little more as well, this was written in a time when we weren't looking at equity in the way that we do now. And of course, now I will tell you, when I was going through my MPA, there were 3 pillars of public administration. Equity was not one of them. And of course, now as you're going through, there are now 4 pillars of public administration, and equity is one of them. The challenge with respect to efficiency and equity is that in the traditional economist sense, and I'm not saying that this is true necessarily, but the traditional economist sense is that efficiency and equity have an inverse relationship, that to increase equity means you have to reduce efficiency. That is, I am not here to say that that's necessarily true. I think that it's now really up to us as we continue to work with the research to figure out what the true relationship is. I think it's basically made on some other assumptions. That's not to say they can't have an inverse relationship, but there can be other inverse relationships that can exist at times, like between efficiency and effectiveness. There are times where there can be inverses in that. But so when we think about policy change, when the time that this was written, we were dealing with efficiency and distribution. I would say now that in many cases in policy change, we also would add efficiency and distribution. And I would argue on the distribution side, that's where equity comes in. You know, we're continuing to look back at what's happened as a result of some changes that have occurred during COVID, and we look back at the PPP program. We realize that the program was not set up in a way to truly be equitable. It was an attempt. This was, of course, a policy change that occurred that was done very quickly, had to be done very quickly, and was applied in such a way that it did reach a lot of people in a fairly efficient manner, not incredibly efficient, but a fairly efficient manner. But the distribution with respect to equity was very poor, in the fact that a lot of smaller businesses, a lot of the independent businesses, and in particular, minority-owned businesses, really did not have equal access or effective access to being able to obtain the money through the PPP program. That was probably, I don't know, and I'm not going to say that was intentional. What I will say, though, it was a significant, seriously bad oversight. I think we can agree to that. So what we have to understand is that, especially in today's world, as we're trying to address mistakes that have been made in the past and poor policy decisions that have been made in the past, is we have to figure out how to be efficient and facilitate an equitable distribution in terms of facilitating policy change, because that's kind of the expectation. Also, with respect to policies, we have to remember that all policies, there are two aspects to it. There's one which is the action, and two, what they call monetary transfer scheme, which can be as simple as simply allocating some money to something and spending it on something like, an infrastructure, or it can be, if you're looking at from the standpoint of social programs, figuring out how to distribute funds to serve to try to create a certain social benefit. And then you kind of have this idea that hopefully the values equal out, and you kind of have what's known as a balanced budget effect. So does anybody have any comments or questions with respect to this? I don't spend a lot of time talking about Pareto because it's not, and I apologize. I do apologize. I was thinking of the wrong book. This book was written more recently than the book that I was thinking of. The book from other class was written in the 70s. This book was written in the last 5-6 years. So I was kind of surprised that equity is not part of this. But the fact is that we do have to think about it in terms of policy changes. And at the same time, what we're trying to accomplish with it is trying to achieve a policy where the value of the results of the action are consistent with the amount of resources that we apply to it. And Tim, why don't you talk a little bit about that if you can, what you just posted to me.
So you may recall in the middle 1990s or so, the federal government enacted some budget restraints on itself, saying that if you had to, if you wanted to have new spending in one area, you needed to have an offset cut in another area, basically a way to try and reduce the implication on any tax increases and to try and stay as close to revenue neutral as possible. And it's what is credited for giving the federal government its surpluses towards the end of the 90s. And then the law sunset in the early 2000s. So we've then had deficit spending ever since. It just seems to me like that was a very good example of what a Pareto effect would be like in government in practice.
Absolutely. Just remember that there were a lot of factors that led to those surpluses, including the fact that at that time we were still putting more money into Social Security than we were taking out. So that also could, because when they would post those surpluses, it was all in revenue as opposed to separating out Social Security tax revenue. But at the same time, what you're talking about with the PAYGO policy definitely had a lot of influence in that area. So excellent point. Are there any other questions with respect to Pareto? Okay. So what I want to do now is I wanted to spend some time before I get into the assignment reminder. There were some of you, I believe, that had contacted me needing to find a group for the group project. Am I correct? I think there was a few of you. So here's what I'd like to do, because everybody's on Zoom. If you still need a partner for the group project, would you raise your hand? Okay, Savannah. Okay. JR. Okay, so Savannah, JR, that means, do both of you need partners? Okay, Matt as well. Okay, So that's 3. So why don't the 3 of you get together and form up a group? Is that okay? Okay. Okay. So if the 3 of you will set that up, and I will, is everybody okay if I share with y'all a group directory? I have to remember that when it comes to fall semester that we may have new students and such, and so not everybody necessarily knows each other. Is it okay if I share the email directory with everybody?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yes.
Okay, there's no objection to it. Okay. Just make sure. Okay, don't see any objections, so I will send that out tonight. Okay, let's talk about the assignment. We're going to do chapter 4 next week. There may be some, I need to check and make sure about the week 4 viewings. Y'all received the email yesterday for the podcast assignment number 1, which is due by 6 p.m. next Tuesday. Y'all should have received that. Tomorrow, well, by Thursday, I should have the reading and lecture assignment number 1 form done. And then next week, we will make, next week, I'll make the topics available. It is first come, first serve. You will have a chance to fill out a Google form to identify your top 3. Only one member of the group needs to do this, and that will be due by September 20th as well. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining tonight, and I hope you all have a good rest of the evening and a good week, and I will see you next Tuesday.